Okay, I think it's time to begin again. So welcome back to this weekend Vipassana retreat based on insight into emptiness. We're now in session 3 titled Boundaries. So let's have a look at what we'll be covering in this session here. We'll begin with a meditation, and another emptiness of person meditation, looking for the person. And this time though, we'll use a little bit the idea of impermanence as a basis for this practice. We saw in the last retreat, in the Vipassana retreat on the 3 marks of existence, how impermanence is really the basis of all other insights into suffering, no self, and emptiness. And actually how an insight into impermanence is very close to an insight into emptiness. So we'll be drawing on a little bit this insight into impermanence and building that into this practice here. So a little bit of a impermanence flavor to the emptiness practice. After the meditation, we'll begin with a review of some of the points we covered in this morning's sessions. Then the main topic here will be about how we make boundaries, how we turn this world that we create into a world that seems to be made up of many separate things already. And then we'll be looking at the 4 steps to this emptiness practice before we go back to the practice. So we'll be laying out in a very clear way the steps involved in this practice, so we have clear what we are doing in this emptiness practice. And then we'll be following that up with another emptiness practice following these 4 steps. Time for question and answer at the end of the session as per normal. Let's begin with that meditation. So finding a nice comfortable posture, let's begin. Establishing a good posture. 2 most important things with the posture is the back straight, and at the same time allow the entire body to be completely relaxed, completely at ease. And softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. All the muscles around the eyes, soft and relaxed. And having established a good posture, then keeping the body as still as possible, avoiding any unnecessary movement, as this will just cause distraction. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm, simply flowing naturally and effortlessly. And not dwelling in the past, not anticipating the future. In particular, letting go of any expectations for this meditation. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. and simply rest in that stillness. Now, do you have a sense that there's a me here who is meditating? A me who is relaxing the body and resting in this stillness. And simply rest in that experience of being me, the meditator, me, the meditator. The me who is meditating here. Don't analyze it, just be with that experience of being the meditator. Now, the body is a constant flow of physical change. So just rest in that experience of that constant flow of physical change. Now, is there a me to be seen in that flow? Or is there just physical flow? Now, the mind is a constant flow of mental experience. So just rest in that flow of mental experience that is the mind. Now, is there a me to be seen in that flow? Or is there simply a flow of mental experience? And so, if there's only a constant flow of physical change that is the body, and there's only the constant flow of mental experience that is the mind, then where is me, the meditator? And so, if the meditator is nowhere to be seen there, just rest in that experience of not seeing, not finding the meditator. But isn't there someone here experiencing this? So there's a me meditating here. But isn't this me simply a name that is being applied to the flow of change that is the body and the flow of change that is the mind? And so we can bring the meditation to a close. Starting with a short review. As we saw earlier, the foundation of all Buddhist traditions are these Four Noble Truths. And in the Four Noble Truths, what is identified as the fundamental ignorance, fundamental distorted view, is this grasping to self, autonomous self. And so therefore, if we want to overcome mental afflictions and suffering, we need to come to realize there's no such autonomous self. And so this is the core of a Vipassana practice that will enable us to achieve the goal of nirvana. And this is the sort of the basis of Theravada Buddhist traditions, these Four Noble Truths. Whereas in this retreat here, we're basing it on a set of teachings from the Buddha called the Perfection of Wisdom teachings, the Heart Sutra being one of the most well-known of those teachings. And here the Buddha went on to say that the world doesn't exist as it appears. Even though there seems to be an independent, objective world out there, the world does not exist in that way. And so then our fundamental distorted view is grasping onto an independent me, independent, objective world. And therefore, to overcome that fundamental distorted view, we need to come to realize this emptiness, to realize nothing exists independently. And thereby we can achieve this full enlightenment. And this really is the sort of the core of Vipassana practice in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, this wisdom of emptiness. And here I think we have a little bit more parallels to quantum physics, whereas within the Four Noble Truths, there's probably more parallels to sort of classical physics, particularly in terms of impermanence. And so I'd like to read another quote from the field of physics. And this one is from Andre Linde, who's professor of physics at Stanford University. And he says the following: "The current scientific model of the material world obeying laws of physics has been so successful that we forget about our starting point as conscious observers and conclude that matter is the only reality and that perceptions are only helpful for describing it. But in fact, we are substituting the reality of our experience of the universe with a conceptually contrived belief of an independently existing material world. Is it possible that consciousness, like time-space, has its own intrinsic degrees of freedom, and that neglecting these will lead to a description of the universe that is fundamentally incomplete? What if our perceptions are as real, or maybe in a certain sense are even more real than material objects? The standard assumption is that consciousness plays a secondary subservient role, being just a function of matter and a tool for the description of the truly existent material world. But let us remember that our knowledge of the world begins not with matter, but with perceptions." So this also is sort of leaning into this idea that things existing within our conceptual framework. And so the view here we find from these perfection of wisdom teachings is this view of emptiness, that things are empty of inherent existence because they are dependent arising. So this term empty of inherent existence is emptiness. So remember that emptiness doesn't mean nothing, things are empty of existence. Things are empty of existing independently. So emptiness means that. And they're empty of independent existence because they exist dependently. In other words, they're dependent arisings. They come into existence dependently. We saw there that we can talk about dependent arising in three ways. That things come into existence through causes and conditions. Things exist depending on their parts. And that also things depend on labeling, imputation, designation, conception, that things only exist within our conceptual framework. We saw there that this labeling is not simply putting a name on objects that are already there. That's not labeling. Labeling is the process of creating objects, because remember, we're only seeing a mass of sense data. There are no discrete objects there to begin with. It's just a mass of sense data that we are perceiving, particularly visual data. And we are literally creating meaningful objects and then giving a name to those objects so we can function. This is labeling. Labeling is drawing the line, creating the object, and giving a name so we can communicate. How we divide up the world, how we draw the lines is completely arbitrary, depending on the meaning that we want to get out of what we experience. And so therefore, things are merely labeled, meaning things only exist within our conceptual framework. They're not findable there in the basis. You cannot find objects within the basis because we create the objects in our conceptual mind. And so that brings us to one of the main topics for this session, and that is the idea of making boundaries. When we look out on the world, we have to draw lines, create objects, give names. Otherwise, we can't function. So there's no problem with that. In fact, we must do that to make sense or meaning out of what we perceive. The problem is that we don't realize that's what we're doing. And so what we're doing is we're turning lines into boundaries. We are believing that the world is already divided up into many separate, discrete things. We don't really experientially appreciate we are creating our world of experience. And so if we get to highlight that, let's go back to the example of the pen. When we looked at the pen before in terms of parts, we said that the pen is merely labeled depending on the parts. That is the correct view. That the pen, like everything else, is merely labeled depending on the collection of parts, meaning the pen is not the collection of the parts. That's what we think. So what we are doing is we are fusing the label with the basis. And we have that in our language. We say, this is a pen. Correctly speaking, we should say really, pen is something I'm labeling or applying that label pen to this collection of data here, collection of parts. And so what we've done is we've turned the lines we draw into boundaries. We now see the world is already divided up into many separate, discrete things. But you may ask the question, well, why is that a problem? Why is it a problem to see the world is already divided up into many separate, discrete things? One way that's a problem is that things now seem to be very static and unchanging. The material world is changing moment by moment. However, the label pen, we'll use the pen example, this basis we see here for pen, this is changing moment by moment. However, the label pen is static. And if we fuse the label to the basis, suddenly the basis seems very static because this is a pen. So it doesn't really seem to change. So we end up grasping onto things which are changing as unchanging because we are fusing the label with the basis. But at a deeper level, what we are doing then is we are seeing things which are dependent as independent. That by fusing the label to the basis, we're saying this is a pen. Suddenly there seems to be a pen there existing objectively independent of us, when we didn't really appreciate that we are creating the pen by applying that label to this ever-changing basis. Suddenly, instead of really appreciating that, we now see there's a pen there objectively. It's already a single thing, a pen. So we're seeing this pen, which is dependent existence in terms of our conceptual framework, as suddenly independent. Why is that a problem? That grasping onto things existing independently is the root of all of our mental afflictions and suffering. Let's see how that making boundaries or turning lines into boundaries is really the root cause of all of our mental afflictions and suffering. For this, we're going to use that first handout, this Suffering and Its Causes handout. So if you've got a printout of that, that would be good. But what I've done in this slide here is I've sort of got the essential parts of the slide that we'll go through now. And we'll look at that handout a little bit more in the later sessions as well. So there is a process, a 6-step process of how turning lines into boundaries really is the root cause of all of our mental afflictions and suffering. We see this here in this Suffering and Its Causes chart. The first step is what's called seed of ignorance. Here, ignorance is this making boundaries, or in other words, another way of saying that is grasping onto things existing independently, that exist objectively there, that the world is made up of many separate discrete things. Seed of ignorance means habit. We have the habit of turning lines into boundaries. And as we look out on the world appears to exist independent of us. There seems to be a me here and a world there. So there seems to be this subject-object duality. But this view of emptiness is saying the things do not exist as they appear, that this appearance is deceiving us. Hence, it's called mistaken dualistic appearance, that things mistakenly appear to exist independent of us. And because we have the habit of then grasping onto those appearances, we never question appearances, because everything has always appeared to us to exist independent of us. We've never seen the world in any other way. And if we ask anyone else, everyone else will agree with us and say, yeah, that world seems to be out there objectively. So we never question these appearances. So therefore, we just automatically go to step 2. We've made a boundary, we're grasping onto those things existing there objectively. Now, whenever we experience anything, we have a mental factor called feeling that's always present. Now, feeling in Buddhism doesn't mean emotion. So when we see the word feeling in Buddhism, it's simply a mental factor of us experiencing things as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So let's say we are looking out and we're seeing a flower. That flower seems to exist completely independent of us. We have the habit of believing that. We never question that. We just grasp onto it. Yep, there's a flower there existing independently. So that's ignorance. We've turned the line. We don't really appreciate that we've actually drawn a line and created an object called a flower. It just seems like the flower's there. And then let's say when we're looking at that flower, we have a pleasant feeling. That pleasant feeling, with our mistaken belief that that flower exists objectively, in other words, having turned a line into the boundary, leads to the third step, misconception. Because if we're having a pleasant feeling and that flower really seems to exist there objectively, independently, we'll go on to mistakenly think there must be some attractive quality there causing my pleasant feeling. So we'll see that flower as inherently attractive or objectively attractive, attractive from its own side. Or if I'm having an unpleasant experience when I see that flower, together with the mistaken belief that that flower exists objectively there, will lead us to think that there must be some unattractive quality there causing my unpleasant feeling. So we'll see it as inherently unattractive. Or if I'm having a neutral experience, which means neither pleasant nor unpleasant, that will lead us to a misconception that that flower has inherently neutral qualities. So once we get to step 3, this misconception, step 4 easily follows. Because again, let's say I'm having a pleasant experience when I see that flower. I like pleasant experiences. I want pleasant experiences. That flower seems to be causing my pleasant experience. I want that flower. that's attachment. Or if I'm having an unpleasant experience, when I see the flower, I don't like unpleasant experiences, I don't want unpleasant experiences, that flower seems to be causing my unpleasant experience, get it out of here, aversion. Or if I'm having a neutral experience when I see that flower, that will simply reinforce my mistaken belief that that flower exists there objectively independent of me, which is this ignorance. Here at this stage 4, we often see, instead of the word ignorance, confusion. So here confusion means ignorance. Confusion here doesn't mean we're confused about whether or not it's a flower. We're confused about how it exists. In fact, we grasp onto it existing independently. So what we see then at step 4 are the 3 core mental afflictions, those 3 poisons that we briefly mentioned earlier. Now, all other mental afflictions come out of one of those or a combination of them. And so that's what's driving our behavior. And then every action we do based on a mental affliction has a consequence, has a result. And the Buddhist assertion is that our actions lead to our experiences. And our experiences collectively, the Buddha described them using this word dukkha, which again is most commonly translated as suffering. We saw that in the First Noble Truth. So this is how our distorted view of reality, of how turning lines into boundaries leads to attachment to pleasant, aversion to unpleasant, and the whole mess starts from there. That's driving our behavior, leading to various experiences of suffering. So this is how turning lines into boundaries is really the root cause of all of our mental afflictions and suffering. Therefore, if we want to overcome mental afflictions and suffering, we need to go back to the underlying root cause, which is this mind of ignorance, this grasping onto things existing independently. Therefore, to overcome that, we need to come to an insight into emptiness, to come to realize nothing exists independently. If we can come to realize emptiness, we can come to overcome ignorance, thereby misconceptions, thereby mental afflictions, thereby the actions driven by those mental afflictions, and thereby the suffering that they produce. And hence we can achieve liberation from mental afflictions and suffering. So that is the brief introduction into this chart here, which we're going to return to a number of times in the coming sessions, particularly tomorrow. So what we can see here is that the long-term strategy is we need to realize emptiness, to overcome ignorance. However, that may take some time. So in the meantime, it'd be helpful to have an effective short-term strategy to at least minimize the impact of this process. And that's something we're going to be looking at in one of the sessions tomorrow. Now, in terms of making boundaries, in most of our experiences, the very first line we draw is we draw a line around here and we create the experiencer. Because there's single experience. And within single experience, there are 2 aspects. There's experiencer and experienced. And we need to be able to distinguish those 2 aspects of single experience. Otherwise, there's no sense or meaning. And I understand, I think a newborn baby has difficulty doing that they have to learn to do that to be able to start to have some sense or meaning of the world. Therefore, again, it's a necessary step. So no problem with drawing a line, creating the experiencer. We can give it a label, me, I, experiencer, subject, whatever label we want to apply. And then we create the world of experience. We create the various objects of the world of experience and label those. Again, the problem is that we turn this line into a boundary, that we don't realize that we're really creating the experiencer in all of our experiences. We contract around the experiencer, we turn the line into a boundary, and therefore we see or believe that the me The experiencer is something already separate, independent of what we experienced. So we split ourselves off from the experienced, see ourselves as independent of what we experience. So this is called self-grasping, grasping onto an independent self, independent me. And therefore, we are completely out of sync with the interdependent nature of reality, because experiencer only is relative to experienced. But by grasping onto the me, believing and seeing ourselves as independent of what we experienced, we are then fighting and struggling against reality. And the more that we fight against reality, the more that will lead to mental afflictions and suffering. But this self-grasping is completely irrational. And to highlight that, we can use our old example here of the pen, and I can ask a question of this pen here that you see. Is this big? Is it big? We can't answer, can we? Because big only exists relative to small. So if we put some smaller object next to it, then we would say the pen is big and that is small. So big only exists relative to small. Similarly, up exists relative to down, and in to out, and me exists relative to not me. You, world, whatever label we want to apply. So you can only have me relative to not me, experiencer relative to experienced. But by grasping onto the me and believing that we exist independently, this would be exactly the same as saying this is big. When we look at that pen, it just doesn't make any sense. Now, this self-grasping tends to be quite strong very often. We often have this this me perspective in our experiences, that there's me doing this, me saying that, me going there. It's always this me, me, me. We with a strong sense of an independent me. So the more we grasp onto the me, the more we are out of sync with reality, the more likely mental afflictions, the more likely we will have suffering. But sometimes in our experiences, this self-grasping is not as strong. And this often happens when we're more focused on the activity rather than the agent. For example, if we're absorbed in reading a good book, absorbed in watching an interesting program on TV, absorbed in solving a problem at work. On those occasions, we're more focused on the activity and less on the me. So this self-grasping tends to be less. And we know from our own experience on those occasions, time seems to go quite quickly and things seem to flow quite well. Why? Because we're not fighting and struggling as much, because a little bit less self-grasping, because we're more focused on the activity than the agent. And this is very much highlighted in people who have developed a high level of focus in their activity. For example, professional musicians, professional athletes who spent thousands of hours of training in their activity and have developed a high level of focus. So much so that when they engage in their activity, they often report that they're in the flow state or they're in the zone. And so what they're saying here is that they're so focused on the activity, the sense of me is dropping away, even to the point where there's not much of a sense of me anymore. And they often say, well, there was no me here really, there was just the music playing, there was just the activity happening. Not only that, but in those occasions, they report peak performance, optimum performance. Why? Because we're more in sync with the interdependent nature of reality. We're not fighting against it through that self-grasping. Here, though, we want to go one step further, not just reduce self-grasping a little bit through more focus on the activity, which is helpful. What we're wanting to do is eliminate self-grasping altogether, realizing there's no independent me here to begin with. And we do this through this Vipassana practice of emptiness, to really come to realize there are no boundaries. There is not one single boundary in the entire universe. There's certainly no boundary between here and what we experience. There's no boundary at all, anywhere. And by realizing emptiness, or another way of saying that is realizing no boundary, that will lead us to have boundless love and compassion for everyone else. Now, love and compassion for others, bit of a struggle because there seems to be a boundary. There's me here, them there. You know, that's their problem, not my problem. You know, if they're suffering, if they're my friends, maybe I'll help them. If I don't like them, in fact, I hope they suffer. They deserve to, because they're sort of bad people, evil people. But if we realize emptiness, then what you will find is if suffering arises, whether it's in this body or that body, equal. The natural response is compassion. Natural response is compassion. This is one measure of whether or not our emptiness practice is going well. If it's going well, we should start to notice that our level of love and compassion for others is increasing, because we're cutting down those boundaries that we've artificially put up. There are no boundaries in terms of independent existence. Now, how to realize no boundary? How to realize emptiness? One of the classic approaches to that, and that's what we've been following and we'll do again now, is that very much recommended to start with investigating me, the person. We can realize emptiness by investigating anything. Me, the person, the body, the mind, flowers, cups, whatever. But it's this where we start to go wrong. We draw the line, we create me, but then immediately we grasp onto independent me and thereby grasp onto independent world. So this is where the process starts to go wrong. And me is something we're very familiar with. So it's often recommended we start there. How to investigate this me? Does the me exist independently? A number of approaches. One classic standard approach, and that's the one that is very nicely described in His Holiness's book, the one recommended one for this weekend retreat, How to See Yourself as You Really Are. His Holiness says there are 4 major steps toward realizing that you do not exist in the way you think you do. So this is in the classic meditation text called the 4 essential points. So this is one approach to come to realize emptiness with respect to person, that we do not exist in the way we appear. There's no independent me here. Let's go through those 4 steps and then we'll go to the meditation. The first step is called identifying the target. This is the most important step, and this is where most commonly people go astray in this meditation. And that is that identifying the target is to get a clear picture of how we seem to exist, how we are grasping onto ourselves existing. Now we're really grasping onto this me, this independent me that seems to be here, existing from its own side. We need to get a clear picture of this me that we're identifying with, because that's what we're going to look for. For example, if we're looking for a person, a particular person in a crowded room, but we don't have a clear picture of what that person looks like, then we can look all day and we'll never come to any sort of conclusion whether or not they're in the room. Similarly here, if we don't get a clear picture of how we see ourselves existing, how we're grasping onto ourselves existing independently, if we don't get that clear picture of that me that seems to be here, then when we do the search, it will be inconclusive. This is the most important step. If we get this right, the rest is relatively easy. So then there seems to be this me existing here independently. So at the beginning of the meditation, we can simply rest in that experience of this me that really seems to be here objectively. Get familiar with that experience. That's the me we're going to look for. Now, if the me is existing objectively from its own side, then it must be findable. And it can only exist in one of 2 places. Either it's the same as the body and the mind or different than the body and the mind. That's the second step, called limiting the possibilities, meaning where do we have to search to be conclusive in the search? So therefore, there's only 2 places to look, either within the body and the mind, the same as the body and the mind, or different than the body and the mind. If we don't find the me in either of those 2 places, then that me doesn't exist. So then we can do the search. And then we can do the search in either order. We can either search for the me first within the body and the mind, or different than the body and the mind. The way we've been doing, and most commonly is presented, is first look for the me as the same as the body and the mind, because that's really the only place it could possibly be. Because if the me was something different than the body and the mind, it would mean that we could have a sense of me over there somewhere, completely separate from the body and the mind. And we never have a sense of me that is not somehow based on the body and the mind. So therefore, but to be complete in our search, we have to do that part of the search. Meaning, we must, if it's the me is different than the body and the mind, we must be able to take away the body and the mind and be left with the me. But first, we search: is the me the same as the body and the mind? So then we look for that me in the body. Then we look for the me in the mind. If we don't find the me in the body or the mind, then the me is not the same as the body and the mind. Then we must be able to take away the body and the mind and be left with the me if it's different than the body and the mind. If we don't find the me in either of those two places, then that me is not to be found anywhere. And then we stop the search. If we get to that point and we didn't find, and we rest in that experience of not finding, that experience of not finding is an experience of emptiness. Actually, it's more than not finding. It's a realization that the me is not findable. We can't find it anywhere. So if we get to the point of not being able to find it anywhere, and we've looked everywhere, we rest in that experience. And we hold that experience as long as we can, because that is an experience of emptiness. Allow it to penetrate deeper into our mind. That's the process that we've roughly been following in a couple of the meditations so far, and we'll follow very clearly now in the coming meditation. Now, in that identifying the target, to get a clear picture of how we seem to exist, as a beginner, when we sit down to meditate and we relax the body, then we may not have a solid sense of body anymore. And we relax the mind and the mind goes quiet, then often we don't have a strong sense of me anymore, because the body is quiet, the mind is quiet. Therefore, often it's recommended as a beginner to get a clear picture of how we see ourselves existing experientially, is to think or bring up a situation where there was a strong sense of me. And that's what we're going to do in this meditation. One example is, and that's the one we're going to use now in the meditation, is imagine someone is praising you for something wonderful you did. Imagine such a hypothetical situation, and then just rest in that experience of the me who's being praised. That me who's being praised seems to be very solid, seems to be really right here, existing objectively. That's the me that we relate to, and that's the me on the basis of which then we act. That's the me we need to look for, and not turn it into some sort of intellectual exercise on who we think we are. That's what we're going to do in this meditation now. So let's do that practice and look for the me. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. And with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment, resting in stillness. Now, imagine a situation where someone is praising you for something wonderful you did. Completely amazing what you did. Bring such a experience to mind, a situation to mind. And simply rest in the experience of me being praised. Don't think about it or investigate it. Just rest in that experience of the me who's being praised. You're just such a wonderful person. Wonderful thing you did. Now that me who's being praised, can it be found anywhere? Can the me who's being praised be found within the body? So search thoroughly every part of the body and look for the me who's being praised. Don't try to intellectually answer this, just look. Can the me who's being praised be found anywhere within the mind? Again, search thoroughly every part of the mind and look for the me who's being praised. Now, if the me being praised is different than the body and the mind, you must be able to take away the body and mind and be left with the me. So mentally dissolve the body into space and dissolve the mind into space. Is there a me left over? The me who's being praised? If you can't find the me who's being praised, rest in the experience of not finding. And we can bring the meditation to a close. We have now time for some question answer. Anyone has any questions about anything so far in this or earlier sessions?
There's a question from Thomas in the chat.
Sure. Sure.
Does increased compassion always follow with increased insight into emptiness?
Not necessarily. You can have compassion even while you're grasping onto independent existence. So what you will find, though, is, I mean, we can find quite very compassionate people who have very strong grasping, but in general, there are many variations there, but in general, if we reduce the self-grasping, then compassion will increase, because that, at whatever level, is inhibiting loving kindness and compassion. But it doesn't mean that if we have strong self-grasping, we can't be compassionate. In fact, there are people who are very compassionate and who still have quite strong self-grasping.
Thank you. There's another question from Daniel.
Sure.
If there is no inherently existing autonomous self, can there really be such a thing as free will? If so, could you explain how the two things can coexist?
Right. Yeah, this is going to be a little bit of a topic that we're going to touch on in the next session, where we're going to talk about the two extremes and the middle way. But just a short comment here is, I mean, free will is it's a huge topic. And you can understand it in a number of different ways, I think, what you mean by free will. Often people's idea of free will is the idea that I'm an independent agent and I can do whatever I want. So such idea of free will can't exist from a Buddhist perspective. There's no such thing as an independent agent, that everything is interdependent. So leaving that aside, we can talk a little bit about free will in terms of our ability to choose and navigate in this world. Now, without mindfulness, we're really stimulus reaction machines, more or less. Some stimulus comes, we react out of habit, and we keep perpetuating that cycle. So in that sense, we have very little free will, because we're completely under the control of our mental afflictions and habits and so forth. However, if we initially cultivate mindfulness through shamatha practice, and then in addition to that, we engage in this sort of vipassana practice of emptiness, then within the context of interdependency and causality, then we can talk a little bit about free will in that sense, but not free will in a sense of being independent of causality. That idea just can't exist from a Buddhist perspective. But we'll talk more about this idea and related ideas in the next session. And this is one of the big challenging points, and I think I briefly mentioned it already earlier, is that we are stuck in what's called the two extremes, which we'll look at more in the next session. Is it seems like either there is a real objective functioning world, or there's no world, that there's no other option. So therefore we get stuck. So then we get stuck in this sort of, is there free will or not? And if we're stuck in the two extremes, then then we can forget about an idea of free will.
Thank you. There's another question from Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
What can we do methodologically when we find a sense of self? For example, a sense in the body as a response to praise, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is what we'll be looking at also a little bit more in the next session and tomorrow, is that the flip side of emptiness is dependent arising. That just because we can't find the me doesn't mean there's no me. There is a me, and that me is a me that depends on causes and conditions, depends on body and mind, and depends on labeling, conception. And so to then have that understanding, and that can then be very helpful to understand that the me exists depending on the body. So that if we have some sense, some physical sensations in the body or so, then the me is something we are labeling depending on that, but we're not that. So that's the difference, as we saw with the pen. The pen is not the collection of the parts, and this is something we'll look at more in the next session. The pen is merely labeled depending on the collection of the parts. Therefore, similarly, the me is not something in the body or something in the mind. The me is what we're labeling on the body and the mind. So, for example, let's say we have an ache and pain in our chest, and we say, I'm hurt. There we're labeling me on the chest, but that doesn't mean we're the chest. It means the me at that point is labeled on the basis of the chest. Or if there's some thinking going on in the mind, you say, I'm thinking. And then we're labeling me on the basis of the thoughts. So the me is labeled on various aspects of the body and the mind, depending on the situation. And if we understand that the me is something merely labeled on those things, rather than being those things, then we have the correct view. Then we're not grasping onto independent me, and then we won't lead on to the mental afflictions and suffering. And that's something we'll look at a little bit more in particularly next session. Any more questions there, Martina? Or
Thank you. That's it from the chat.
okay, so if anyone else has any questions I'd like to ask directly, you can use the mic or the webcam or both.
I think Atul is lined up. Yeah.
Atul, yes, I see. Okay. Atul?
Hey, hi, Glenn.
Hi,
Very
Atul.
nice. Hi, very nice session.
Thank you.
So I had a question around. So I was just trying to unpack my own experience while watching the praise situation. So clearly there was a nice glow and a smile inside when that situation came up. I could notice that it wasn't the body because it's not my knee, it's not my hand. When you asked me to look whether it was my mind, it was a little tricky. Thoughts came up about the incident. Somebody praised me, sent an email, blah, blah, blah. And then when you asked me to drop all of this and look beyond, there was silence. But then that silence was immediately filled up with more thoughts, right? On, okay, I'm experiencing this, and, again, the praise and the email and so on. So I just wanted you to sort of reflect on this experience. And also my question was, so is self-grasping equal to thoughts? Because they keep filling up the space all the time, right? It's like generating the sense of self.
Yeah, exactly. And generally our sense of self is constantly reinforced by two things mainly. One is solid sense of body. We have a solid sense, this is me, based on a solid sense of body, me. And then the other thing that's constantly reinforcing our sense of me is thoughts or mental activity, our thoughts, our emotions, our memories, all of this stuff is constantly reinforcing a sense of me. And that's happening throughout the day. But it's interesting, and this is often where, even in shamatha practice, sometimes fear can arise, is that, when you sit down to meditate and you have a very good posture and you're focusing on whatever the practice is, you can even get to a point then where there's no really a sense of body anymore, because your posture is so well set up, there's no aches and pains in the body, and your mind is occupied in the mental sphere, whatever your practice is. So your sense of solid body can go, disappear. And then if you're doing, say, a shamatha practice, observing the mind, and then suddenly all these thoughts go quiet, then there's suddenly no mental activity reinforcing our normal sense of identity. And then suddenly we're caught in the grip of fear because there's nothing substantiating our sense of me, the body and the mind, because this is what we're identifying with as me. This is me. All of this stuff going on in mind, this is me. And when that's no longer there, then there's nothing we can identify as me. And then we often have a lot of fear thinking, oh, I don't really exist, or I'm going out of existence. But then, as I said, if we're having fear, someone's having fear. If you don't exist, there can be no fear. So the fear means you exist. So that should, if we're very intuitive, just that experience can lead to an insight. Well, I'm none of those things. I'm not the body. I'm not the mind. And then what people often do is they go one step back and they go, because I'm awareness. But then we can check that. Are we awareness? That's another meditation, and we'll jump into that a little bit tomorrow. So, so therefore, with these experiences, again, when we're doing searching for the person, then we're looking for the me. In this case, we're looking for the me that's being praised. And that's why that's the most important step. That first step is to really get a sense of the me that's being praised, experientially, the me that's being praised. Because otherwise, if we don't do that, when we do the search, we start to make it intellectual. And we go, well, I'm not the body. They're not praising the body. So no, let's get rid of that. And then we just make it intellectual, and then we go complete, and then we come up with all sorts of intellectual answers. But then we're not doing the practice. We're not being empirical. We're not trying to see how we exist. We're just coming up with some intellectual ideas again, which may be accurate or may not be, but that doesn't matter. We're trying to experientially see how we exist. So if these thoughts come up, then you can see, well, are any of those me, the me that's being praised? If there's some sense in the body, of course, when we're praised, we'll have a lot of probably strong sensations in the body, but is that the me that's being praised, or is that something that me being praised is experiencing? The me that's being praised, isn't it that I'm experiencing that in the body? So we can do like that.
Yeah. Thanks, Lynn.
Sure, at all. Okay, I think was there another quick question anywhere? Otherwise, we'll take a break there.
Yes, and I think you already touched upon it.
Sure.
So the question is, can emptiness be considered pure awareness?
No. Pure awareness. Oof, this is a huge topic. Emptiness is a realization that we and everything else does not exist independently. Awareness is also another word for consciousness or mind. So awareness is something that we have. We have awareness. So if we have awareness, we can't be awareness. So this is a very simple approach we can use as well. Either we are the body or we have a body. If you have something, you can't be it by definition. Either we have a mind or we are the mind. We have a mind, so we can't be the mind. Either we have awareness or we are awareness. We have awareness. So these are all things which we have, which means they're not us. But then we can also investigate awareness itself. Does awareness itself exist objectively? That's what we're going to look at tomorrow. That's the object of investigation tomorrow. Today we're sticking with person and maybe a little bit the body. Tomorrow we're going to look for awareness. In fact, actually in the next session, we're going to move into the mind. We're going to look for awareness. We're going to look for mind a little bit in the next session as well, but also tomorrow. Okay, let's take a break there and we'll come back for the last session. We'll look at this two extremes and middle way. It's a very important topic regarding this emptiness practice. So let's take it'll be about a 25-minute break, and we'll see you back in 25 minutes for the last session.